The freezing rain masked Clara's tears as she stood on the broken auction block. Her own father had just traded her life to settle a tavern debt. An old, scarred blacksmith raised 3 silver coins. Clara closed her eyes, bracing for a lifetime of misery. Suddenly, the murmuring square fell into a terrifying, absolute silence. A massive black stallion parted the terrified townsfolk. The solitary rider, cloaked tightly in dark armor, didn't offer silver. He dropped 100 pieces of gold into the mud. When his steel-gray eyes locked onto hers, Clara realized the truth. The man who had just bought her wasn't a local farmer. He was the sovereign nightmare of the north. The rusted iron hinges groaned as the heavy tavern door swung open. Cold autumn rain swept across the stone floor, splashing against Clara's bare ankles. She kept her head low, her trembling fingers gripping the rough fabric of her stained apron. Across the scarred wooden table sat the village magistrate, his ledger open and his ink dry. "The debt remains unpaid, Thomas," the magistrate announced, his voice flat and devoid of pity. Thomas wiped his sweaty palms against his trousers, his gaze darting toward the dark corners of the room. He refused to look at his daughter, who stood frozen in the center of the damp room. "I have no coin left to give you," Thomas muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. He had gambled away their winter food, their small cottage, and their future. "Then the law is clear," the magistrate said, tapping a blunt finger against the yellowed parchment. "Your land belongs to the crown, and your daughter belongs to the market." A cold dread settled deep in Clara's chest, freezing the breath in her throat. She looked at her father, praying for a spark of defiance or remorse in his tired eyes. She remembered how he used to smile before the grief and the wine consumed him. Thomas merely nodded, staring fixedly at the rotting floorboards between his boots. "Take her," Thomas whispered, his ultimate betrayal cutting sharper than any iron blade. 2 heavy guards stepped forward, their iron gauntlets clamping down on Clara's narrow shoulders. They dragged her out into the muddy square, where the biting wind ripped through her thin wool shawl. Townsfolk gathered in the spreading gloom, their faces masked by indifference and cruel curiosity. Neighbors she had known since childhood turned their eyes away, refusing to meet her gaze. The auction block was nothing more than a broken timber cart standing in the rain. Clara stood aboard the wooden platform, her small body shaking as the freezing rain soaked her hair. The mud below the cart was churned into a gray paste by dozens of heavy boots. "A healthy girl," the auctioneer shouted to the sparse crowd, his rough hand gripping her chin to force her face upward. "She can cook, she can sew, and she can work the bitter winter fields without complaint." He pinched her arm to prove her strength, ignoring the way she winced at his touch. Low bids trickled from the small crowd, offered by brutal farmers and opportunistic local traders. An old blacksmith with yellow teeth offered 3 silver coins, his eyes gleaming with dark intent. Clara closed her damp eyes, wishing the hard earth would open up and swallow her whole. She prayed to the saints for a quick death before the blacksmith could claim her. Suddenly, the murmuring crowd fell completely silent as a heavy shadow fell over the square. The rid-rid thud of iron-shod hooves echoed sharply against the wet cobblestones. People scrambled backward, clearing a wide path as if a ghost had just entered the village. A massive black stallion moved through the parting crowd, its hot breath pluming in the freezing air. The solitary rider sat rigid in the leather saddle, cloaked entirely in heavy black wool and dark armor. No family crest adorned his metal breastplate, yet the absolute authority in his posture commanded immediate submission. This man's a Cedric, though none in this impoverished border town dared speak his true name aloud. To the Khan folk, he was known as the Alpha King, a sovereign whose ruthless rule kept the northern borders secure. Rumors said he possessed the strength of 10 men and a heart forged of molten ice. Cedric reined in his great horse at the edge of the timber cart, his stern gaze hidden beneath the deep shadow of his hood. He looked down at Clara, his gray eyes assessing her drenched form with cold precision. 100 gold pieces, Cedric said, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated through the quiet spur. The auctioneer gasped loudly, his wooden gavel freezing mid-air. 100 gold pieces could buy the entire village, its lands, and the surrounding forests. The crowd stared in total disbelief, wondering why a high lord would pay such a fortune for a peasant girl. Sold, the auctioneer stammered, dropping his stained ledger directly into the mud. Cedric tossed a heavy leather purse at the man's muddy feet, the gold coins clinking sharply inside. The heavy pouch sank into the mire, but nobody dared reach for it while the rider remained. He did not dismount his horse. He merely extended a single gloved hand toward Clara. Clara hesitated, looking fearfully into the dark void beneath his heavy hood. She saw only the sharp glint of steel-gray eyes, cold, unyielding, and ancient. The old blacksmith sneered in the background, a reminder of the horrific alternative that awaited her. Left with no other choice, she reached out and placed her small hand in his massive grasp. With effortless strength, Cedric lifted her onto the leather saddle before him. He pulled her close against his chest, his ironclad arm locking securely around her waist. He turned the black stallion toward the northern gate, leaving the stunned village far behind. The mountain wind howled louder as they left the shelter of the valley, climbing the steep, rocky trails. The path grew narrow and dangerous, bordered by sharp cliffs and dark pine trees. Clara shivered violently, her wet clothes clinging to her pale skin like sheets of ice. Her teeth chattered so loudly that she feared he would grow annoyed and push her from the horse. Cedric noticed her trembling, his iron jaw tightening beneath his dark hood. Without speaking a word, he unclasped his heavy wool cloak and draped it over her narrow shoulders. The thick fabric was incredibly warm, smelling of pine smoke and weathered leather. It enveloped her completely, shielding her from the icy needles of the mountain rain. "Hold the reins," Cedric commanded quietly, his deep breath warm against her cold ear. Clara gripped the wet leather straps, her small hands shaking as she guided the powerful horse forward. She felt the immense strength of his chest pressing against her back, steady and unmoving like a fortress. Hours passed in agonizing silence as total darkness swallowed the dense pine forest. The only sounds were the howling wind and the steady, tireless stride of the stallion. They finally stopped near a shallow stone cave, the horse exhausted from the steep, muddy ascent. Cedric lifted Clara down to the ground, his movements swift, efficient, and surprisingly gentle. He did not drop her into the mud, but set her firmly onto a dry patch of stone inside the cave. He gathered dry twigs from the cave floor and struck a flint, coaxing a small fire into existence. The orange light chased away the oppressive darkness, casting long shadows against the stone walls. Clara sat near the growing flames, wrapped tightly in his massive black cloak. She watched him tend to the tired horse, removing its heavy saddle and rubbing down its flanks. His broad back was turned completely away from her, a wall of dark leather and iron. As he bent over to untie the horse's leather straps, Clara heard a muffled groan of deep pain. Cedric staggered slightly against the horse's flank, his gloved hand pressing hard against his left ribs. He leaned heavily against the animal, his head dropping as he fought for breath. Underneath his torn leather vest, dark blood stained his heavy woolen shirt. The wound was fresh, the crimson stain spreading quickly across the dark fabric. He had been severely wounded, likely in a fierce skirmish before entering her small town. Fear urged Clara to stay perfectly quiet, to remain hidden in the safe shadows of the cave. She knew that injured kings were dangerous, like wounded wolves caught in a trap. Yet looking at his strained, hurting posture, a deeper instinct of compassion took hold of her. She remembered her mother's teachings about healing, about the duty to comfort those who suffer. She stood up slowly, letting the heavy cloak slip slightly from her shoulders. She walked toward him on tiptoe, her footsteps silent on the damp earth. The horse nickered softly as she approached, but it did not move away. "Let me help you," Clara whispered, her soft voice steady despite her lingering terror. Cedric spun around instantly, his gray eyes flashing with dangerous, predatory intensity. He grabbed her small wrist in a flash, his grip like an unyielding iron vice. The pain made his breath ragged, his face pale beneath the grime of travel. Clara did not flinch or cry out, looking directly into his harsh, shadowed gaze. She showed him no malice, only the quiet determination of a healer. "You are bleeding," she said softly, pointing a finger toward his wounded side. Cedric stared down at her, deeply surprised by the complete absence of fear in her expression. Most people fled from his gaze, Yet this frail girl stood firm before his wrath. Slowly, his thick fingers loosened around her bruised wrist. He sank heavily onto a flint rock, his breathing labored as the bright firelight danced across his rugged face. Clara knelt quietly beside him, reaching for her clean apron to bind his deep wound. She tore the white linen cloth into long, neat strips with steady, practiced hands. Cedric watched her silently, his fierce gaze never leaving her gentle face. The silence between them was no longer terrifying, but filled with a strange, unspoken understanding. She pressed the cloth against his bleeding side, her touch deliberate and careful. He tightened his muscles but did not pull away from her soothing hands. The wound was deep, a jagged slice from a sword, but it had missed his vital organs. She cleaned the dirt away with a damp corner of her apron, working with quiet efficiency. For the first time in her life, Clara felt a strange sense of purpose amid her total ruin. She was no longer just a piece of property sold to pay a gambler's debt. And for the first time in his life, the ruthless king allowed someone to see his vulnerability. He closed his eyes, trusting a stranger to tend to his flesh in the dark. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows against the ancient cave walls. Outside, the storm continued to rage through the pines, but inside, a quiet bond was beginning to form. Morning broke with a pale, fractured light that pierced the heavy canopy of the pine forest. The storm had finally exhausted its fury during the long night. Clara woke to the sharp scent of wick smoke and damp earth. She pushed the heavy wool cloak away from her face, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Across the dying fire, Cedric sat entirely awake. He watched the cave entrance with a silent, unbroken focus. His dark shirt remained stained, but his breathing fell into a steady, even rhythm. Clara's crude bandages had held back the bleeding while he rested. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes settling on her small frame. "Drink," Cedric said, tossing a leather water skin across the rocky floor. Clara caught the skin, her fingers brushing the cold, hardened leather. She drank deeply, the icy mountain water soothing her parched throat. Cedric stood up, his tall frame blocking the pale morning light. He moved with a stiff grace, favoring his left side only slightly. He checked the black stallion's hooves before securing the heavy leather saddle. "We ride for the northern ridge," he announced, not waiting for her response. Clara folded his cloak neatly and stood, her damp dress clinging to her legs. She expected him to order her onto the horse with the harshness she had known all her life. Instead, Cedric stepped closer and took the folded cloak from her hands. He draped the heavy fabric back over her shoulders, fastening the iron clasp near her collarbone. His large hands moved quickly, avoiding any lingering touch against her cold skin. He lifted her into the saddle once more, his grip firm but careful. Clara settled against the pommel, pulling the wool tight around her neck. Cedric swung up behind her, taking the leather reins in his gloved hands. The horse moved forward, picking its way down the steep, rocky path. The mountain air bit at Clara's face, carrying the bitter chill of early winter. Yet she felt a strange, radiant heat radiating from Cedric's chest against her back. He adjusted his grip on the reins, pulling her slightly closer to shield her from the biting wind. He did not speak a word of comfort, but his actions offered a quiet, undeniable shelter. They rode deeper into the ancient woods, where the shadows stretched long and black. The path narrowed, flanked by towering rock walls and dense thickets of briar. Suddenly, the black stallion threw its head back and stopped. Cedric went entirely still behind her, his posture turning as rigid as forged steel. Clara felt the sudden shift in his muscles, a silent alarm ringing through his frame. A low whistle sliced through the quiet forest air. 5 men stepped out from the dense underbrush, blocking the narrow trail. They held rusted swords and heavy wooden crossbows, their faces hidden behind dirty linen scarves. These were deserters, violent men who preyed on solitary travelers in the lawless borderlands. The leader stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the heavy gold purse tied to Cedric's saddle. "Dismount and leave the gold," the bandit sneered, raising his iron-tipped weapon. "You might keep your lives if you walk away now." Cedric did not reach for his heavy sword. He simply lowered his head, a dark chuckle vibrating deep within his chest. The sound was terrifying, a low rumble of absolute, predatory confidence. "Hold the saddle horn," Cedric whispered into Claire's ear. She gripped the hard leather with both hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. In a single, fluid motion, Cedric vaulted from the horse. He landed heavily on the muddy trail, placing his large body entirely between Clara and the bandits. The leader fired his crossbow, the iron bolt snapping through the cold air. Cedric stepped sideways, letting the deadly projectile shatter against a pine trunk. Before the man could reload, Cedric closed the distance in 3 massive strides. He struck the bandit with a closed fist, the impact echoing like thunder through the ravine. The leader collapsed instantly, his body thrown backward into the freezing mud. 2 men rushed forward, swinging their rusted blades wildly toward Cedric's chest. He caught the first man's wrist, twisting the bone until the sword fell to the earth. With his free hand, Cedric drove an elbow into the second man's face. The bandits fell like brittle autumn leaves before a violent gale. Clara watched from the saddle, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen tavern brawls and cruel beatings in her village. This was something else entirely, a display of martial perfection and overwhelming power. Cedric moved without panic, dismantling his enemies with precise, brutal efficiency. The final 2 men dropped their weapons and turned to flee into the dark trees. Cedric did not chase them. He stood breathing heavily in the center of the path, his dark cloak swirling around his boots. He wiped a smear of dirt from his jaw and turned back to the horse. Clara stared at him, expecting to see the frantic rage that usually followed male violence. Instead, Cedric looked completely calm, his gray eyes steady and clear. He walked over to the fallen men and kicked their weapons far off the edge of the rocky trail. He checked the stallion's leather harness, ensuring the animal was unharmed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, looking up at Clara. The question was blunt, holding no flowery sentiment, but it shocked her all the same. No one had ever asked about her well-being after a moment of danger. "I am well," Clara whispered, her grip loosening on the saddle horn. Cedric nodded once, a brief acknowledgement before he climbed back onto the horse. He settled behind her, taking up the reins and guiding the stallion forward. They stepped carefully around the unconscious men lying in the mud. The forest grew silent once more, save for the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. Clara rested her back against Cedric, the remaining tension leaving her shoulders. She realized that she was not a prisoner being hauled to a cruel dungeon. She was sitting behind a shield, protected by the most dangerous man in the realm. Her village had cast her out, trading her life for a handful of copper and gold. Yet this terrifying stranger had just fought 5 armed men to ensure her safe passage. The thought confused her, overturning everything she believed about the world and its masters. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic sway of the journey lull her racing thoughts. For the first time since her father sold her, Clara felt a strange, budding sense of safety. The mountain pass leveled out, revealing a vast, sprawling valley below. Far in the distance, dark stone towers pierced the gray winter clouds. The fortress of the north stood like a silent sentinel against the horizon. "That is Ironhold," Cedric said, his deep voice breaking the long silence. Clara opened her eyes, looking out over the frozen landscape. "Is that your home?" she asked, her voice timid against the rushing wind. Cedric did not answer immediately. He looked at the distant spires, a dark shadow crossing his rugged features. "It is a fortress," he replied simply. "It serves a purpose, but a stone wall does not make a home." His words carried a heavy, ancient sorrow that Clara could not fully understand. She leaned back slightly, offering him a silent, fragile comfort in the cold. They rode down into the valley, leaving the treacherous mountain passes behind them. The snow began to fall, dusting the dark pines in a layer of pure, brilliant white. The massive iron gates of Ironhold groaned open as they approached. Torches flickered along the high stone walls, casting dancing shadows over the snowy courtyard. Dozens of armored guards stood at rigid attention. They struck their steel breastplates in unison, a deafening salute to their returning king. Cedric rode the black stallion straight into the center of the keep. Servants scurried out of his path, tipping their eyes firmly fixed on the frozen cobblestones. Fear hung heavy in the air, a silent testament to the ruthless reputation he commanded. Clara shrank back against his chest, intimidated by the sheer scale of the military fortress. He brought the horse to a halt near the ground-beaten steps of the main hall. Without a word, Cedric dismounted and reached up to help her down. His grip remained gentle as he lowered her icy boots to the solid ground. An older woman in a severe gray dress hurried down the steps to meet them. She held a ring of heavy iron keys that clattered loudly at her hip. "My lord," the woman said, bowing deeply. "We did not expect your return before the heavy snows." Cedric nodded briefly, his gaze scanning the busy courtyard. "The northern pass is secure, Ilara," he replied. Ilara finally lifted her eyes, her sharp gaze landing on Clara's trembling, mud-stained figure. She noted the cheap, ruined apron and the oversized wool cloak dragging on the ground. "Shall I send the girl to the scullery, my lord?" Ilara asked briskly. "The kitchen master is always complaining of short hands during the winter months." Clara braced herself, fully expecting to be banished to the dark, freezing cellars. That was the fate of a purchased debtor, a life of endless labor in the shadows. Cedric turned his head, his gray eyes narrowing slightly at the housekeeper. "She is not a servant," he stated, his deep voice carrying across the quiet yard. The nearby guards discreetly shifted their stance, clearly surprised by his words. Ilara blinked in visible shock, but quickly recovered her professional composure. "Of course, my lord," she murmured, bowing her head once more. "Where shall I put her?" Cedric looked down at Clara, studying her pale face and shivering shoulders. "Prepare the east wing chambers," he commanded softly. A collective gasp rippled through the small group of attending servants. The east wing was reserved for honored guests and high nobility, not peasant girls bought at a muddy auction. "And draw a hot bath," Cedric added, completely ignoring their silent astonishment. "Bring her proper clothing and warm food." He turned away from Ilara and looked directly into Clara's wide, fearful eyes. "You will be safe here," he told her quietly. Before she could find the words to thank him, he turned and strode toward the armory. His dark cloak billowed behind him, striking a sharp contrast against the white snow. Clara stood frozen in the courtyard, clutching the edges of his heavy wool mantle. Ilara approached her cautiously, her stern expression softening into quiet curiosity. "Come with me, child," the housekeeper said, gesturing toward the great wooden doors. "The northern wind will freeze your blood if you stand out here much longer." Clara followed the older women into the fortress, stepping over the high stone threshold. The interior of Ironhold was vast and austere, built for war rather than luxury. Huge tapestries depicting ancient battles hung between narrow, glassless windows, yet roaring fires blazed in the massive stone hearths, pushing back the winter chill. They climbed a wide spiral staircase, leaving the noise of the lower halls behind. The east wing was surprisingly quiet, lined with thick woolen carpets that muffled their footsteps. Ilara opened a heavy oak door and ushered Clara inside. The chamber was larger than Clara's entire childhood cottage. A great four-poster bed dominated the room, draped in rich crimson velvet and heavy furs. A large copper basin sat near a crackling fireplace, already filled with steaming water by two silent maids. "Leave us," Ilara instructed the maids, closing the door firmly behind them. The housekeeper turned to Clara and gently unfastened the heavy iron clasp at her throat. Cedric's cloak slid heavily to the floor, leaving Clara in her ruined, freezing dress. "Step into the water before you catch a fever," Ilara urged gently. Clara shed her wet garment with numb fingers and stepped into the copper tub. The heat was immediate and overwhelming, drawing a sharp gasp from her lips. She sank beneath the fragrant, soapy water, letting it wash away the mud and the terror of the past 2 days. For a long time, she simply sat there, staring at the dancing flames in the hearth. She could not comprehend the sudden, impossible shift in her reality. Her father had sold her to pay for cheap wine and bad debts. She was supposed to be beaten, starved, and worked until her bones snapped. Instead, she was sitting in a copper bath in the safest fortress in the north. Ilara handed her a squirt of coarse soap and a rough linen cloth. "Wash your hair," the older woman instructed, pulling a wooden stool closer to the tub. "The master does not tolerate dirt in the guest wing." Clara scrubbed her skin until it turned bright pink, washing away the stench of the tavern and the mud of the road. When she finally stepped out of the water, Ilara wrapped her in a massive heated towel. The housekeeper produced a simple but finely woven woolen dress from a wooden chest. It was dyed a deep, warm blue, lined with soft linen that felt like a caress against Clara's skin. She slipped the dress over her head, marveling at the absence of patches or frayed hems. A young servant girl quietly entered the room, carrying a silver tray laden with food. There was a bowl of thick mutton stew, half a loaf of fresh bread, and a wedge of pale yellow cheese. The rich aroma made Clara's empty stomach cramp with fierce anticipation. She sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, her wet hair wrapped in a towel. She ate quickly, terrified that someone would march in and snatch the tray away. Ilara watched her with a mixture of pity and calculated intrigue. "Slow down, girl," Ilara warned softly. "The master's larder is full and nobody is going to steal your supper." Clara paused, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. She looked at the older woman, searching her lined face for any hidden cruelty. Finding none, she lowered the bread and took a slow, deliberate breath. "Why is he doing this?" Clara whispered, her voice barely louder than the crackling fire. Ilara sighed, folding her hands neatly over her gray apron. "I have served Lord Cedric since he took command of this fortress," she replied. "He is a hard man, forged in blood and endless war." She walked over to the window, looking out at the snow falling over the courtyard. "But he does not punish the weak," Ilara continued. "He destroys those who prey upon them." Clara looked down at her clean hands, processing the housekeeper's words. The ruthless king, feared by the entire realm, was the only person who had ever shown her mercy. The contrast was dizzying, challenging every terrifying story she had heard in the village square. A sudden sharp knock interrupted her swirling thoughts. Ilara opened the door to reveal a tall guard wearing the black armor of Cedric's personal retinue. "The master requires the girl in the main hall," the guard announced flatly. Clara's heart skipped a beat, her newfound comfort instantly evaporating into familiar dread. She stood up quickly, abandoning the remains of her meal on the small wooden table. Ilara gave her a reassuring nod, smoothing out a wrinkle in Clara's new blue dress. "Hold your head up," the housekeeper murmured. "You are no longer a beggar in the mud." Clara took a deep breath and followed the armored guard out into the dimly lit corridor. As she walked, she noticed the intricate carvings on the high stone pillars. They depicted snarling wolves and ancient warriors locked in eternal combat. The fortress was a monument to violence, yet she felt surprisingly safe within its walls. Every guard they passed stood perfectly still, their faces hidden behind dark iron visors. None of them leered at her or whispered cruel jokes as the village men used to do. Discipline ruled this place, cold and absolute. Her bare feet made no sound against the thick carpets as she walked back toward the lower levels. The warmth of the bath still lingered on her skin, but a nervous chill settled deep in her chest. She was about to face the sovereign of the north once more. This time, there was no raging storm or deadly ambush to distract him. There was only the quiet, terrifying reality of the massive stone fortress they now shared. The grand doors of the main hall swung open silently on their well-oiled hinges. Clara stepped over the threshold, her hands clutched tightly in front of her blue dress. The cavernous room was stripped of all decoration, dominated entirely by a massive hearth and a long oak table. Firelight danced across the stone walls, fighting back the creeping shadows of the evening. Cedric sat at the head of the heavy table, surrounded by scattered parchment and iron weights. He had removed his dark armor, wearing only a simple tunic of black wool that stretched across his broad shoulders. His silver-gray eyes lifted from a sprawling map as she entered the room. The armored guard bowed stiffly and withdrew, leaving them completely alone. Clara stood frozen near the doorway, unsure where a purchased debtor was supposed to stand in a king's hall. She half expected him to point to the cold stone floor at his feet. "Come here," Cedric said, his deep voice echoing in the empty space. He did not yell, yet the quiet command left no room for hesitation. She walked forward slowly, the soft wool of her new dress brushing quietly against the floorboards. As she approached the table, Cedric pushed a heavy wooden chair out with his boot. It was the chair directly to his right, a place of honor usually reserved for trusted generals. "Sit," he instructed, setting down his quill. Clara climbed into the tall seat, her feet barely brushing the stone floor below. Cedric poured a cup of warm, spiced cider from an iron jug and pushed it toward her. She wrapped her cold hands around the metal cup, drawing comfort from its steady heat. For a long moment, he simply watched her in the flickering light. He noted the clean dampness of her hair and the faint color returning to her pale cheeks. "The magistrate in your village," Cedric began, his tone neutral and calm. "Did he strike you?" Clara blinked, entirely caught off guard by the sudden question. She looked down into her dark cider, watching the small spices swirl in the warm liquid. "No," she answered truthfully. "He only cared about the copper and the law." Cedric leaned back in his heavy chair, folding his arms across his chest. "And your father?" he asked, the words sharper this time. A fresh wave of grief tightened Clara's throat, threatening to spill over into tears. She remembered the endless nights her father spent drinking away their winter grain. "He lost himself after my mother died," Clara whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "He traded my freedom to clear his ledger." Cedric's jaw tightened, a dangerous shadow passing over his rugged features. He understood the dark abyss of betrayal better than any man in the realm. "A father is supposed to be a shield, not a blade," Cedric stated quietly. "He will never see you or a single copper of my gold done." Clara looked up, searching his serious face for any hint of a cruel joke. There was none. He offered a heavy, absolute protection that anchored her floating anxiety. Before she could formulate a proper response, the heavy doors of the hall banged open. A scout rushed into the room, his leather armor caked in fresh snow and black mud. The man dropped to one knee, breathing heavily as he bowed his head. "My lord," the scout gasped, handing over a sealed roll of parchment, "trouble at the southern ridge." Cedric took the letter, breaking the red wax seal with a swift flick of his thumb. His eyes scanned the jagged handwriting rapidly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as a cold fury settled over him. Clara watched the dangerous shift in his posture, the sudden tensing of his powerful frame. He was no longer the quiet man offering her warm cider. He was the Alpha King, a warlord preparing for retribution. "The mercenaries we routed yesterday were not acting alone," Cedric announced, looking at the kneeling scout. "They are gathering near the old crossing, paid by the local merchants to disrupt our supply lines." "How many men?" the scout asked. "Enough to burn a dozen villages if they cross the river," Cedric replied. He stood up, his sudden movement knocking his heavy oak chair backward. Clara flinched, shrinking instinctively against the high back of her own seat. She clamped her hands over her ears, anticipating the violent outburst that usually accompanied a man's rage. Cedric stopped instantly. He looked down at her cowering form, his expression softening in a fraction of a second. He carefully righted his chair and took a deliberate step back. "I am not angry with you, Clara," he said, using her name for the very first time. The sound of her name on his lips was strange, grounding her spiraling fear. He knelt beside her chair, bringing his face level with hers so he would not tower over her. "You have nothing to fear in this fortress," Cedric swore, his gray eyes locked directly onto hers. "The violence stays outside these walls." Clara lowered her hands slowly, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm in her chest. She nodded, offering him a small, fragile gesture of trust. Cedric stood up and turned his attention back to the waiting scout. His voice returned to the cold, authoritative baritone of a seasoned commander. "Rouse the cavalry," Cedric ordered, rolling the parchment tightly in his fist. "Tell the vanguard to saddle their horses and prepare for a night ride." The scout saluted sharply and ran back out into the freezing courtyard. Cedric turned to the fireplace, staring into the roaring flames for a long moment. "Will you fight them?" Clara asked into the silence. She did not know why she spoke, only that the thought of him riding out injured terrified her. "I must," Cedric answered, not looking away from the fire. "A king cannot rule from behind a closed door." Clara thought of the jagged, bloody wound she had bandaged just a day ago. She slipped down from her large chair and walked over to where he stood. She reached out, her small fingers lightly grazing the rough wool of his sleeve. "Your side is not fully healed," she reminded him softly. Cedric looked down at her hand, staring at it as if she held a drawn sword. No one had dared to question his physical strength in over a decade. To show weakness was an invitation for betrayal in his harsh world. Yet this fragile girl, who had lost everything, was genuinely worried for his life. He reached up and gently placed his large hand over hers, holding her fingers against his arm. "I have fought through worse pain," Cedric assured her, "and this battle will end before the morning sun crests the mountains." He released her hand and stepped back toward the heavy wooden table. He unrolled the map once more, studying the winding blue line of the southern river. Clara returned to her seat, wrapping her hands around her cup of cider. She watched him trace the enemy positions, his face a mask of supreme concentration. The impending violence outside did not touch the quiet sanctuary they shared in the hall. She was a castaway, pulled from the darkest depths of despair and set upon solid rock. For now, she would sit by the fire and wait for the sovereign to return. The heavy oak doors closed behind Cedric, leaving Clara alone in the silent hall. She stared at the dying fire, listening to the muffled shouts echoing from the snowy courtyard. The fortress came alive with the harsh sounds of marching boots and clinking steel. Clara walked to the narrow window, pulling the blue wool tight around her shoulders. Below, hundreds of armored riders gathered under the falling snow. Cedric sat atop his black stallion, raising his heavy sword into the freezing air. The men roared in unison, a terrifying sound that shook the ancient stone walls. Then the vanguard rode out into the darkness, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Hours stretched into a restless, agonizing night. Clara paced the floor of her grand chamber, unable to find comfort in the velvet bed. She walked back to the cold window, staring at the empty white valley. Her entire life had been defined by hunger, cold, and a constant gnawing fear. Her father had viewed her merely as a tool to balance his ruined ledgers. Now she lived inside a fortress, protected by a man who ruled with iron and blood. The sudden shift in her reality kept her mind racing through the dark hours. Ilara entered quietly, carrying a fresh cup of herbal tea. "You will wear holes in the carpet, child," the housekeeper said softly. Clara stopped her pacing, rubbing her tired eyes. "Will he be all right?" Clara asked, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon. Ilara set the silver tray on a small wooden table near the hearth. "He has survived 100 battles," Ilara answered, adjusting the fire with an iron poker. "He conquered the northern wastes when he was barely older than you." Clara sat on the edge of the large bed, wrapping her hands around the warm teacup. "They call him a monster in my village," Clara admitted quietly. Ilara offered a sad, knowing smile. "Men call him a monster because they fear his unyielding justice," she replied. "He does not tolerate thieves, liars, or those who abuse their power." The older woman looked thoughtfully at Clara's clean, unharmed face. "But he has never brought anyone back to the guest wing before," Ilara added. Clara looked down, a hot flush warming her pale cheeks. She was just a debtor's daughter, a broken girl bought for a bag of gold. Yet her heart ached with a strange, fierce loyalty to the hardened commander. Meanwhile, near the freezing waters of the southern river, the mercenary camp slept poorly. 50 armed men huddled around smoking fires, dreaming of stolen wealth. They never heard the quiet approach of Ironhold's heavy cavalry. Cedric struck just as the midnight clouds swallowed the pale moon. He did not bother with complex siege tactics or prolonged negotiations. He rode directly into the enemy camp, his heavy sword flashing in the firelight. The mercenaries scrambled for their weapons, blinded by panic and snow. Cedric swung his blade with precise, devastating force. He shattered wooden shields and broke iron weapons, cutting a path straight to the rebel leader. He moved through the chaotic camp like a shadow of pure vengeance. The enemy commander raised a heavy axe, screaming a desperate battle cry. Cedric deflected the clumsy blow effortlessly and kicked the man backward into the dirt. The impact sent the rebel crashing into a burning wagon, ending the fight instantly. "You trespassed on my lands?" Cedric stated, his deep voice carrying over the chaos. The remaining men dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in the frozen mud. Cedric signaled his guards, ending the swift skirmish without losing a single soldier. He did not stay to watch the prisoners being bound with heavy ropes. He turned his black stallion around, spurring the exhausted beast back toward the mountains. His wounded side burned with a dull ache, but he ignored the pain completely. His mind focused solely on the stone fortress and the fragile girl waiting inside. Morning light broke slowly, painting the snowy peaks in hues of gold and pale pink. Clara sat in a chair near the grand staircase, wrapping her cold hands around her empty cup. She had refused to return to her bed until the heavy gates opened. A loud horn blasted through the quiet morning air, startling the sleeping servants. The iron hinges groaned loudly as the outer gates swung wide. Clara dropped her cup and ran toward the main doors, ignoring Ilara's sudden warning. She pushed through the heavy wood, stepping out into the freezing courtyard. The returning soldiers looked exhausted, their dark armor covered in a layer of white frost. Cedric rode at the front of the column, his posture rigid and uncompromising. He scanned the crowded yard, his tense shoulders dropping slightly when he spotted her. He dismounted quickly, handing the leather reins to a waiting stable boy. He walked straight toward the stone steps, bypassing his generals and eager servants. Clara stood frozen on the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. He looked terrifying, covered in mud and the harsh grime of a brutal battle. Yet, as he stopped before her, his fierce expression melted into quiet relief. "You are awake," Cedric noted, his breath pluming in the cold air. "I could not sleep," Clara admitted, her voice trembling with raw emotion. She looked carefully at his torn tunic, searching for any signs of fresh blood. "Are you hurt?" she asked, reaching a hesitant hand toward his chest. Cedric caught her fingers gently, pulling her hand away from his dirty armor. "I am untouched," he promised, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. "The traitors have been handled." Clara let out a shaky breath, a sudden tear slipping down her cheek. She did not know why she was crying for a man she had met only 2 days ago. Cedric frowned, lifting a gloved hand to wipe the tear away. "There is no need for tears," he said softly, his rough thumb surprisingly gentle against her skin. "I told you I would return." "Men often break their promises," Clara whispered, remembering her father's endless lies. Cedric looked down into her eyes, his steady gaze anchoring her fractured soul. "I am not other men," he replied simply. He offered her his arm, waiting patiently in the falling snow. Clara placed her hand on his dark sleeve, feeling the solid muscle beneath the heavy wool. They walked back into the warm fortress together, leaving the Cold War behind them. The guards watched in respectful silence, acknowledging the silent shift in their lord's demeanor. Inside the great hall, the hearth fire had been stoked into a roaring blaze. Cedric guided her to the long oak table, pulling out the same heavy chair from the previous night. He sat down beside her, ignoring the exhausted officers waiting for his final report. For the first time in his long, violent reign, the king chose peace over protocol. Clara watched him rest his head against the high wooden chair, his eyes closing in sudden exhaustion. She reached out and pulled a thick wool blanket from a nearby chest. She draped it carefully over his broad shoulders, tucking the edges around his cold arms. Cedric opened one eye, watching her quiet, deliberate movements. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, softening the harsh lines of his rugged face. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. Clara sat back in her chair, a deep sense of belonging finally taking root in her heart. Winter tightened its icy grip on Ironhold over the following weeks. Heavy snowbanks piled against the high stone walls, sealing the fortress from the outside world. Inside, the harsh reality of military life continued, governed by strict drills and silent patrols. Yet, the atmosphere within the great hall had subtly shifted. Clara no longer hid in her grand chamber when the heavy iron bells rang for the evening meal. She sat to Cedric's right every night, a quiet presence amidst his hardened war council. The generals, initially suspicious of the fragile girl, soon learned to hold their tongues. They noticed how their ruthless commander softened his tone whenever she entered the room. They watched him push the finest cuts of roasted meat onto her silver plate. Clara had blossomed under the consistent warmth and safety of the fortress. Her hollow cheeks filled out, and a healthy pink flush returned to her pale skin. She wore simple but elegant dresses of ape emerald and warm burgundy, tailored specifically for her. She spent her mornings in the vast library, surrounded by dusty tomes of history and healing. Ilara taught her the complex management of the fortress kitchens and storerooms. Clara absorbed the knowledge quickly, determined to earn her place in this strange new world. One freezing afternoon, Cedric found her sitting near the hearth in the empty library. She was carefully grinding dried willow bark with a heavy marble pestle. He stood quiet in the doorway, watching the focused, graceful movement of her small hands. "You should rest, Clara," Cedric said, stepping into the warm room. Clara looked up, her face brightening instantly at the sound of his deep voice. "The healers need this powder for the men's winter joints," she explained, tapping the pestle. "It helps them walk the cold walls without pain." Cedric walked over and gently took the heavy stone tool from her fingers. "I have strong men to grind bark," he replied, setting the pestle on the table. "I did not bring you here to labor in the dust." He pulled a heavy wooden chair closer and sat beside her, the firelight catching the silver threads in his dark hair. "I want to be useful," Clara whispered, looking down at her hands. "My father always said I was a burden, a mouth too expensive to feed." Cedric reached out, his large hand gently lifting her chin so she was forced to look at him. "Your father was a fool, trapped by his own weakness," Cedric stated firmly. "You are the brightest light this dark fortress has seen in a decade." Clara's breath hitched, her heart fluttering wildly against her ribs. He had never spoken so openly about his feelings, usually burying his emotions beneath a mask of iron authority. "Come with me," Cedric instructed, standing up and offering his hand. Clara placed her fingers in his warm grip, letting him lead her out of the quiet library. They walked down a long, winding corridor that Clara had never explored. The guards stepped back silently, granting them passage into the deepest part of the eastern wing. Cedric stopped before a massive set of double doors, carved with intricate silver vines. He pushed them open, revealing a vast, glass-domed conservatory. Clara gasped, stepping over the threshold in complete disbelief. The room was filled with lush, blooming flowers and vibrant green vines. The air was incredibly warm, smelling of damp earth and sweet summer rain. It was an impossible oasis hidden within the frozen, brutal stone of Ironhold. "My mother built this place," Cedric said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "She hated the northern winters, the endless gray skies and the bitter cold." He walked toward a large stone fountain in the center of the room, trailing his fingers through the clear water. "She died when I was very young," he continued, looking at a delicate white rose. "The lords who served my father tried to burn this room after she passed." Clara walked up beside him, her heart aching for the lonely boy he must have been. "Why would they do that?" she asked softly. "Because beauty is considered a weakness in the north," Cedric explained, his gray eyes turning hard. "They wanted a savage king, a weapon to point at their enemies." He turned to look at Clara, the hardness vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "So I gave them exactly what they asked for," he said. "I became the monster they needed to protect these borders." Clara reached out, wrapping her hands gently around his thick forearm. "You are not a monster," she told him with absolute certainty. Cedric looked down at her small, determined face, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. "I have killed more men than I can count, Clara," he confessed quietly. "I have burned ships and broken rebellions with absolute cruelty." "You did what you had to do to survive," Clara argued, stepping closer. "You protect your people, and you protected me when you owed me nothing." She reached up, her soft fingers lightly tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "You have a kind heart, Cedric," she whispered, using his name with quiet reverence. No one had ever touched him with such gentle, fearless affection. He closed his eyes, leaning slightly into the warmth of her small hand. The ruthless warlord surrendered completely to the soothing touch of the fragile girl. He opened his eyes, the cold steel in his gaze replaced by a deep, burning devotion. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Clara did not resist, burying her face in the soft wool of his dark tunic. She felt the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beating against her cheek. They stood in the center of the winter garden, the snow falling heavily against the glass dome above them. The contrast between the brutal world outside and the fragile peace they had built inside was absolute. He was the dangerous sovereign, the alpha king feared by an entire continent. She was the discarded daughter, a forgotten girl from a ruined village. Yet, in the quiet warmth of the conservatory, they were equals, bound by a mutual, desperate need for salvation. Cedric buried his face in her soft hair, inhaling the faint scent of dried willow and clean soap. He knew then that he would burn the entire realm to the ground before he let anyone take her away. The broken girl had not only healed his physical wounds, she had resurrected his buried soul. The deep winter snows finally began to recede, leaving dark patches of earth visible across the valley. Ironhold prepared for the arrival of the spring merchants and the southern envoys. Clara stood on the high stone balcony, watching the heavy iron gates open for a large diplomatic caravan. Banners of crimson and gold fluttered aggressively in the cold wind. They belonged to the Southern Coalition, a powerful alliance of wealthy lords who constantly tested Cedric's northern borders. Clara wrapped her dark velvet shawl tighter around her shoulders. She recognized the arrogant swagger of the Southern Guards as they marched into the courtyard. They looked exactly like the men who used to collect her father's gambling debts. Elara stepped onto the balcony, her iron keys clinking softly. "The master requests your presence in the great hall," the housekeeper announced. Clara turned, feeling a sudden knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "He wants me at a diplomatic reception?" Clara asked, her voice faltering slightly. "He commanded that a seat be placed at his right hand," Elara confirmed, with a small, proud smile. Clara took a deep breath, smoothing the heavy emerald fabric of her gown. She walked down the grand spiral staircase, her heart beating a rapid rhythm. The great hall was crowded with armored knights, wealthy merchants, and southern nobility. The air smelled heavily of expensive perfume, roasted meats, and political tension. Cedric sat at the head of the massive oak table, wearing his dark armor and a heavy wool mantle. His posture was relaxed, yet his silver-gray eyes tracked every movement in the room with predatory precision. The hall fell completely silent as Slajastad threw the heavy wooden doors. Every eye turned to watch the unknown girl in the emerald dress. She kept her chin high, remembering the quiet strength she had found in the winter garden. Cedric stood up as she approached, an act of respect that sent a shockwave of whispers through the southern delegation. He offered his hand, and Clara placed her fingers securely in his warm grip. He guided her to the tall wooden chair directly beside his own. Directly across the table sat Baron Vance, the leader of the Southern envoys. Vance was a wealthy, cruel man who wore too many gold rings and a sneer of permanent disdain. His dark eyes scanned Clara with open, insulting calculation. "Is this the new northern custom, Lord Cedric?" Vance drawled, swirling the dark wine in his silver cup. "Bringing a common peasant to a council of high lords?" The northern generals bristled instantly, their hands dropping toward the hilts of their swords. Cedric raised a single finger, silencing his men without saying a word. "Clara sits where she pleases in my hall," Cedric stated, his voice completely devoid of warmth. Vance chuckled, leaning forward heavily against the oak table. "I know exactly who she is, Cedric," the Baron countered, his smile twisting into a malicious grin. "My spies tell me you bought her from a mud-soaked auction block in a border village." Clara froze, the blood draining rapidly from her face. The nightmare of her past had breached the heavy stone walls of Ironhold. "Her father owed taxes to the Southern Crown," Vance continued, pulling a fawed parchment from his silk tunic. "According to the old laws, the sale was illegal without my sovereign's stamp." Vance tossed the yellowed parchment onto the table, the paper sliding to a halt near Cedric's plate. "The girl is stolen property," Vance declared loudly, ensuring the entire hall could hear. "I have come to claim her and return her to the Southern debt camps, where she belongs." A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the great hall. The fire crackled in the hearth, sounding incredibly loud in the quiet room. Clara gripped the edge of the wooden table, her knuckles turning bone white. She waited for the familiar terror to consume her, but it did not come. Instead, she looked at Cedric, trusting the iron bond they had forged during the long winter. Cedric did not look at the parchment. He did not shout, nor did he reach for his heavy sword. He slowly picked up his iron goblet and took a calm, deliberate sip of wine. He set the cup down, the metal clinking sharply against the wood. "You misunderstand your position, Vance," Cedric said softly. The low volume of his voice carried a deadly, crushing weight. "You think you are standing in a courtroom," Cedric continued. "You are standing in a wolf's den." Vance scoffed, though a flicker of genuine hesitation crossed his arrogant face. "The law is the law," the Baron insisted, gesturing toward the paper. "If you refuse to surrender the girl, you invite war with the entire Southern Coalition." Cedric leaned forward, resting his powerful forearms on the table. "Let me explain Northern law to you," Cedric replied, his silver eyes locking onto Vance. "I am the law." With a sudden, explosive movement, Cedric drove his hunting dagger through the center of the parchment. The heavy steel blade embedded itself deep into the thick oak table. Vance jumped backward, his silver cup clattering to the stone floor and spilling red wine like blood. "The girl stays," Cedric commanded, his voice vibrating with absolute, terrifying authority. "And if a single Southern soldier steps foot across my river to claim her, I will not stop at the border." Cedric stood up to his full, towering height, casting a massive shadow across the envoy. "I will march my army south. I will burn your estates to ash, and I will mount your head on my gates." The Southern guards stepped forward, their hands resting on their weapons. In a fraction of a second, 50 northern knights drew their longswords. The sharp ring of drawn steel echoed violently through the cavernous hall. The envoys found themselves completely surrounded, trapped by a force of overwhelming, lethal loyalty. Vance raised his hands quickly, his arrogant sneer replaced by pale, sweating terror. "There is no need for violence," the Baron stammered, stepping away from the table. Cedric stared down at him with utter contempt. "Then take your men and leave my fortress before the sun sets," Cedric ordered. "If I see your banners in my valley tomorrow, there will be no survivors." Vance nodded sharply, turning on his heel and marching toward the heavy doors. The southern delegation followed him in hurried, silent panic. The northern guards did not sheathe their weapons until the heavy oak doors slammed shut. The great hall slowly exhaled, the suffocating tension breaking apart. Clara sat perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cedric reached out and pulled the dagger free from the table, tossing the ruined parchment into the blazing fire. He turned to Clara, his expression softening instantly as he met her wide gaze. He knelt beside her chair, exactly as he had done on her first night in the hall. "Did he frighten you?" Cedric asked, his voice returning to a gentle, steady baritone. Clara looked at the burning paper, watching the last trace of her old life turn to ash. She looked down at the fearsome warlord kneeling at her feet. "No," Clara answered, a genuine radiant smile breaking across her face. "I knew you would never let him take me." Cedric reached up and gently brushed a stray curl away from her cheek. "Never," he swore, his gray eyes blazing with an unyielding vow. "You are the heart of Ironhold now, Clara. Anyone who wishes to harm you must break me first." Clara slid out of her tall chair, kneeling on the stone floor directly in front of him. She wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, pulling him into a fierce embrace. Cedric held her tightly, ignoring the lingering stares of his generals. He buried his face in her dark hair, drawing strength from her profound courage. The men of Ironhold watched in silent reverence. They knew they had just witnessed the crowning of their true queen. The broken girl from the mud was now the most protected woman in the realm. The southern delegation fled Ironhold before dusk, leaving a trail of panic in the mud. Word of Cedric's brutal defiance spread rapidly across the continent. Instead of marching north to wage war, the southern coalition retreated, terrified of the Alpha King's wrath. Spring finally broke over the northern mountains, melting the last of the heavy snow. The valley surrounding the fortress bloomed with hardy white wildflowers and thick green grass. Clara stood in the vast central courtyard, holding a woven basket filled with fresh herbs. She wore a simple gown of light wool, her dark hair braided neatly against her back. The soldiers who passed her no longer cast fearful or suspicious glances. They bowed deeply, recognizing her as the true sovereign of their formidable king's heart. She walked toward the stables, her boots making a soft sound against the dry cobblestones. Cedric was there, brushing the sleek coat of his massive black stallion. He wore no armor, only a light linen shirt that clung to the heavy muscles of his back. He paused as she approached, setting the wooden brush on a nearby barrel. "You are up early," Cedric noted, his silver eyes softening instantly. "The healers needed fresh mint," Clara replied, holding up her small basket. "And I wanted to see you before the morning council." Cedric reached out, taking the basket from her hands and placing it next to the brush. He pulled her close, his large hands resting securely on her waist. Clara leaned against his chest, inhaling the familiar scent of leather, pine, and clean sweat. "The council can wait," Cedric murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "I have spent too many years arguing with old men over grain and borders." Clara smiled, resting her cheek against the steady rhythm of his heart. "Yet you rule them perfectly," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet pride. Cedric chuckled, the deep sound vibrating through his broad chest. "I rule them because they fear the blade," he corrected her softly. "But they follow you because they recognize a true queen." He stepped back slightly, keeping his hands on her arms. "Ilara tells me you have ordered the old granaries to be rebuilt," he said, "and that you opened the eastern wing to house the orphans from the lower villages." Clara looked up, suddenly worried that she had overstepped her unspoken authority. The winter was hard on the common folk, she explained quickly. I remember what it means to be hungry, Cedric. I could not sleep knowing children were freezing while our hearts burned bright. Cedric did not look angry. He looked profoundly moved. He reached up, lightly tracing the curve of her jaw with his thumb. You do not need to justify your kindness to me, Clara, he swore quietly. This fortress is yours to command. Every stone, every soldier, and every coin belongs to you. Clara's breath hitched at the absolute devotion in his voice. He had given her more than protection. He had given her an entire kingdom. A young stable boy ran into the barn, panting heavily. My lord, the boy gasped, skidding to a halt before them. A rider approaches from the south, bearing the royal crest of the coalition. Cedric's jaw tightened, the gentle lover instantly vanishing behind the mask of the warlord. Did Vance return to test my patience? Cedric demanded, his hand dropping to the heavy dagger at his belt. No, my lord, the boy stammered, his eyes wide with fear. It is a single messenger, carrying a chest of gold and a treaty of permanent peace. Clara gasped, her hands flying to cover her mouth in shock. The southern lords had never surrendered without a prolonged, bloody war. Cedric's tense posture relaxed slightly, a dark, victorious smile touching his lips. Tell the guards to let him through, Cedric commanded the boy, and send the chest directly to the orphanages in the lower village. The boy bowed low and ran back toward the main gates as fast as his legs could carry him. Cedric turned back to Clara, his silver eyes shining with fierce satisfaction. They finally understand, he said, his voice echoing in the quiet stable. They know that Ironhold is no longer just a military outpost. It is the heart of the realm, and you are its pulse. Clara reached up, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. She pulled him down, pressing her lips firmly against his in a sudden burst of overwhelming joy. Cedric responded instantly, his powerful arms wrapping around her small frame, lifting her entirely off the ground. He kissed her with a desperate, crushing intensity that chased away the last lingering shadows of her past. When he finally set her down, Clara was breathless, her face flushed with brilliant color. I love you, she whispered, the words escaping her lips as naturally as drawing breath. It was the first time she had spoken the vow aloud. Cedric froze, his imposing frame going perfectly still. He stared at her, his rugged face caught between profound shock and utter adoration. The ruthless Alpha King, who had conquered mountains and destroyed armies, looked entirely undone by 3 simple words. Say it again, he demanded thickly, his voice breaking slightly. Clara smiled, reaching up to cup his rough, scarred cheek. I love you, Cedric, she repeated, her voice clear and absolute. More than my life, more than my freedom. He crushed her against his chest once more, burying his face in the dark silk of her hair. He did not need to say the words back. His entire being radiated a fierce, eternal vow of love and protection. The broken girl had tamed the monster, not with a sword, but with an open heart. 3 years passed, transforming the brutal stone walls of Ironhold into a vibrant sanctuary. The great hall no longer echoed solely with the harsh clatter of weapons and grim war councils. Instead, it resonated with the bright, unfiltered laughter of rescued children. Clara walked down the wide eastern corridor, holding the small hand of a boy named Leo. Leo had been found wandering the snowy southern roads 2 winters ago, freezing and abandoned. Now he wore a warm wool tunic of northern blue and carried a carved wooden knight. Is the king angry today? Leo asked, his big brown eyes looking up at Clara with innocent curiosity. Clara smiled, squeezing his small hand reassuringly. The king only gets angry at wicked men, Leo, she promised gently. They entered the sunlit courtyard, where the heavy winter snows were merely a distant memory. Cedric sat on a low stone bench, his long legs stretched out comfortably in front of him. He wore no dark armor, only a rich tunic of deep silver that caught the afternoon light. He was completely surrounded by 6 children from the fortress orphanage. The fearsome warlord was currently holding a tiny girl on his wide knee. He was clumsily trying to braid her blonde hair with his thick, scarred fingers. The northern generals stood nearby, watching the impossible scene with quiet, respectful amusement. Claire paused in the doorway, her heart swelling with an overwhelming amount of love. This was the ruthless Alpha King, the man whose very name terrified the entire continent. Yet here he was, completely conquered by a handful of rescued orphans. Leo let go of Clara's hand and ran excitedly across the cobblestone courtyard. Lord Cedric, the boy shouted, holding his wooden toy high in the air. Cedric looked up, his severe features breaking into a wide, genuine smile. He carefully set the little girl down and caught Leo mid-stride, lifting him effortlessly into the air. The boy giggled wildly, soaring above the stone courtyard in the king's massive hands. "Will you teach me to ride the black horse today?" Leo asked breathlessly. Cedric chuckled, settling the boy onto his broad shoulders. "You must master the pony first, little wolf," Cedric replied, his deep voice rumbling pleasantly. "But if you practice well, I will make you a knight of Ironhold one day." Clara walked forward, the sunlight catching the delicate silver crown resting on her dark hair. Cedric stood up, carefully lifting Leo down to the ground before turning to meet her. He wrapped a strong arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "They exhausted my personal guard before noon," Cedric noted, looking at the running children. "Perhaps I should send them to patrol the southern border instead of my soldiers." Clara laughed softly, leaning her head against his solid shoulder. "They would probably conquer the entire coalition in a week," she agreed playfully. Cedric kissed her temple, his silver-gray gaze sweeping over the peaceful fortress. The courtyard was alive with merchants, farmers, and soldiers mixing freely. "Ironhold has changed," Cedric murmured, his voice thick with a sudden profound emotion. "It used to be nothing more than a tomb of ice and iron. Now it feels alive." Clara looked up into his eyes, searching the depths of his familiar gaze. They held no darkness, no lingering shadows of the violent, lonely past. They were clear, warm, and entirely devoted to the life they had built together. "You gave them a home, Cedric," she reminded him softly, resting her hand flat against his chest. "You gave all of us a safe place to heal." Cedric turned fully toward her, taking both of her hands in his much larger ones. "I only built the stone walls, Clara," he swore quietly, raising her knuckles to his lips. "You brought the fire." Later that evening, they stood together on the high balcony adjoining their grand chamber. The setting sun painted the valley in brilliant strokes of gold, crimson, and deep violet. The landscape below was dotted with new cottages and thriving, well-fed farms. The people no longer looked up at the high stone towers with fear and quiet resentment. They looked toward Ironhold with deep gratitude and fierce, unbreakable loyalty. Clara watched the orange sun dip behind the jagged western peaks. She thought of the frightened, starving girl standing on the muddy auction block. That girl felt like a stranger now, a ghost from a completely different lifetime. Her father's ultimate betrayal had ironically been her absolute salvation. It had dragged her into the darkest corner of the world, only to push her into the brightest light. Cedric stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping a heavy fur mantle carefully around her shoulders. The evening wind carried a slight chill, a gentle reminder of the approaching autumn. He stood right behind her, crossing his powerful arms over her chest to hold the fur in place. "The southern envoys have requested permission to trade grain for our iron," Cedric mentioned casually. "Baron Vance's successor seems much more polite than his predecessor." Clara leaned back against him, feeling the steady, comforting rumble of his chest as he spoke. "Will you allow them to cross the river this time?" she asked, watching the darkening sky. "Only if they agree to your new trade taxes," Cedric replied smoothly. "The orphanages and village schools require constant funding, after all." Clara smiled warmly, marveling at how naturally he shared his absolute power with her. He never questioned her judgment or tried to restrict her growing influence. She was his equal in every possible way, ruling the massive northern territory by his side. The faint sound of a lullaby drifted up from the lower gardens where the nurses tended the children. Cedric closed his eyes, resting his chin heavily on the top of her head. "I used to hate the endless silence of this fortress," he confessed into the evening wind. "I filled with the soldiers and violent war councils just to drown out the emptiness." Clara turned in his arms, wrapping her hands securely around his narrow waist. "And now?" she asked, looking up at his handsome, deeply scarred face. "Now, I have everything I never knew I wanted," Cedric answered, his voice rough with pure devotion. He bent down, capturing her lips in a slow, fiercely passionate kiss. It was a kiss that held the massive weight of their shared history. It held the memory of the freezing cave, the bloody ambushes, and the quiet, healing moments by the hearth. It was a promise of absolute fidelity, forged in fire and bound in unbreakable iron. Clara kissed him back eagerly, pouring all of her love and boundless gratitude into the embrace. She had been sold to a monster to pay a broken man's gambling debt. She had expected a short life of endless suffering and dark, lonely despair. Instead, she had found a family, an entire kingdom, and a love that defied the very stars. The terrifying Alpha King had not broken her spirit. He had simply cleared the bloody path for her to rise. Together, they would rule the northern mountains until the end of their days, and Ironhold would never be cold again.
I just love how Clara and Cedric found a safe haven in each other. It reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments lead us exactly where we belong. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from today? Also, I'd love your help. What kind of story should we explore next? Leave your ideas below. See you next time!